Hello and welcome to all of our viewers. I'm Heinrich in New York, and joining me from Israel today to discuss the country's judicial reform is Professor Gadi Taub. Gadi is an author, historian, a thought leader in Israel, and a prominent top political commentator. Thank you so much for being with us today, Gadi.
Hi, Tal. It's a pleasure.
Let's get right to it. What is the problem with the current judicial system in Israel, the way you see it, the way Netanyahu's government sees it? Why is there so little public trust in the country's Supreme Court?
Well, it's not just a judicial system. It's our substitute government. What happened in the 4 decades since Likud first lost power to the old hegemonic Labor party is that the left has been transferring the center of political power from electoral branches of government to appointed branches of government, that is, to the bureaucracy and above all to the Supreme Court. Currently, there is no limit to the Supreme Court's power. I'll say something about that because it sounds hyperbolic, but it's actually a definition in political science. There is nothing that the court sees to be outside its purview, and it thinks it has the final decision on everything, including not just striking down legislation, but also exercising judicial review on what we have as a constitution. So imagine the Supreme Court in America striking down Article 2 of the Constitution, and you'll begin to see how radical this is. Now, these people also have a veto power over their own appointments. So basically what happened is that we have a radical, ultra-liberal Supreme Court, which has turned into the uber government of Israel and has subdued the elected branches of government.
So what should be the role of the Supreme Court, the way you see it, as opposed to how it functions now in a country that doesn't have a constitution? Upon what basis should laws passed by the parliament be upheld or struck down, if at all?
Well, first of all, the court announced that we do have a constitution. That was part of its usurpation of power. It took our basic laws, as they are called, which had no normative advantage on other laws, until the Supreme Court Chief Justice, Aaron Barak, who is if you combine John Marshall with Earl Warren, you'd still be only at knee heights compared to Barak's hubris. And he declared that he gave us a constitution based on basic laws, which were passed in a half-empty parliament because no one realized that they are going to be used as props for striking down normal or regular legislation.
Let's just backtrack a little.
But yeah. Sure.
Let's just backtrack a little to give our viewers a sense of who Aaron Barak is, the previous head of the Israeli Supreme Court, who back in the 1990s enacted a judicial revolution. He took the court in Israel in a very interventionist, activist course, enforcing his liberal, more progressive philosophy, one that, Gadi, to the surprise of many, even Justice Elena Kagan on the U.S. Supreme Court sort of refrained from embracing during her confirmation hearing on Capitol Hill, even though she does call Aaron Barak her hero.
That's because Aaron Barak recognized no limit on his power. So after they enacted this judicial revolution in which the court announced Marbury versus Madison style that it has the power of judicial review unilaterally, the second phase was to announce that it has the power of judicial review over the basic laws too. So now it has the power of judicial review over the laws that gave it the power of judicial review. This means that there is no limit to its power. There is no norm above the Supreme Court or a norm that it has to abide by. I'm not going to get into the other details. They also basically vacated many laws without striking them down by their ability to interpret them in a way that to call it creative would be a real understatement. They can turn it around. For instance, there is a law in Israel that does not allow parties who do not recognize Israel as a Jewish democratic state or who support racism or support terrorism run for parliament. There's a party, an Arab party, which the heads of which supported Hezbollah, even in the midst of a war with Israel. And Aaron Barak managed to interpret this away, saying that there was not a critical mass of evidence for their support of terrorism. And people here jokingly said that for Aaron Barak version of critical mass, anything short of coming into the chamber with a bomb would not be considered support for terrorism.
So speaking of extreme, Gadi, the many people in Israel who oppose this reform, they say it's an extreme measure. It's too extreme. But when you compare what's happening in Israel to other democracies, Western democracies around the world, and the reform that's on the line, where does it balance off? Where do you place Israel?
I think it's way too light. I think it still leaves too much room for the judges to intervene in everything, and there is much to do. Now, I want to specifically address the idea that the people who are against the reform keep raising, and that's that the weakening the court will weaken the protection of human rights. And that's just preposterous, because this court has not been defending human rights. It has not been defending minorities. It has been defending the minorities that the liberal elite likes. It has been very discriminatory towards the Orthodox, the ultra-Orthodox, and the national religions. When Israel evacuated Gaza, these people, including girls of 14, were arrested without the right of habeas corpus. Sometimes their ability to protest, the whole national religious sector of the population had their democratic rights of protest curtailed, and the most striking, I think, this court is just a rubber stamp for a wild law enforcement policy in Israel, and an attorney general and the office of the state attorney who are there's. If you go to an Israeli court, if you face prosecutors from the office of the state attorney, your chances to be acquitted are about zero. We have one of the highest conviction rates in the democratic world. So a citizen who faces this is the most vulnerable place for human rights, right? It's when they can take away your liberty, they can take away your money, they can take away your family, they can take away your reputation. You basically do not have the basic protections of proper procedure and the presumption of innocence. Basically, in an Israeli court, not formally, basically you have to prove that you are innocent.
And even if you are found innocent at the very end, well, your entire reputation and your life could be tarnished all along the way.
Think General Flynn. This is a probe that was specifically politically targeted at someone. But this is what any Israeli facing the criminal justice is facing: bankruptcy and the loss of your name and your dignity.
In recent weeks, Gadi, we saw tens of thousands of people marching through the streets of Tel Aviv, mainly, but other cities as well, protesting this reform pushed by the Netanyahu government. And they are crying that if passed, it would be the end of democracy in Israel. But the argument that you're making here, and not only you, but rather many people on the Israeli right, is that democracy was crushed by the Supreme Court itself by striking down, narrowing down legislation that was passed by democratically elected public representatives. Is that right? And I also wanted to ask you, what are you reading into these protests then?
This is preposterous, because the fact that they are hiding behind the slogans that they are protecting democracy is the exact opposite of the truth. This reform is about to end the juristocracy, the rule of judges, the oligarchy that enables Israel, small upper crust of a liberal elite, to hold power. So this is not the end of democracy. It is the end of their tyranny. And they are clinging by the skin of their teeth to power, which the reform is going to restore to the rightful owners, which are the citizens. So this is a struggle about sovereignty.
I want to read to you something that Professor Alan Dershowitz told us, who opposes the reform. So I'm quoting, and I want your reaction. He says, every democratic country has a conflict between an elite court, and courts are not supposed to be reflective of the popular will. They're supposed to be checks on democracy, not part of democracy.
Well, with all due respect, I completely disagree with Professor Dershowitz's analysis, because I think, and this is going on in Israel, and I think it's a problem with the legal profession, that they tend to think of the separation of branches of government usually as if the court is either only or mostly a check. The problem in Israel is that there is no check on the court. The court can do anything, and it crushes minorities, and it crushes liberal human rights. So what I told you about the legal system, the criminal legal system, is look at who's protecting rights here. In our legislation, Parliament has written on the books laws that are humane, that protect people in custody, that protect defendants. And who crushed these rights? The police, the attorney general, and the courts. And the courts in Israel are mostly manned by people who come from the prosecution, and their tendency is prosecutorial. So the assumption that the court would necessarily be liberal doesn't hold in Israel at all. It doesn't even always hold in America. And let me remind you of the Dred Scott case. You can't just assume that judges will be naturally on the side of human rights. So if you have a system of checks and balances, remember, if you think of the founding fathers of the United States, what they understood is that no center of power should go unchecked. And the idea that the stronger the judiciary is, the stronger the protection of rights is just completely mistaken. No branch of government should be allowed to concentrate too much power, or else rights and liberties will be abused or crushed.
I want to ask you more specifically about something that happened last week. The Israeli Supreme Court just ordered Prime Minister Netanyahu to fire his deputy, Aryeh Deri, a minister that Netanyahu wanted to appoint. And the court said that the notion of Deri serving as a government minister is, quote, unreasonable in the extreme. Do you see this case as the Supreme Court protecting the Israeli people from a convicted criminal because Deri has been convicted in the past, or is it an extreme example of judicial overreach?
It is an extreme example of judicial overreach and a demonstration that this whole thing is a political struggle. It's a political struggle, not a judicial controversy. And they demanded the firing of Deri without any basis in the law, because Deri was convicted long ago on bribery, and he served time, and also served the chilling period before he could return to politics, 7 years. And now he was convicted on a tiny technical infringement of tax reporting, and that's all. And there's nothing illegal about him serving as a minister. And strikingly, when he struck a plea deal in which they say they were given to understand, it's not in the plea deal, but they were given to understand that he would retire from political life. And then he didn't. And he ran in the elections. And it was clear that he's going to be a minister. And when did petitions from the left arrive? Only after Netanyahu set up his government. Because if there was a government on the left and Deri was a candidate for them, no chance in the world that petitions would have arrived or that the courts would have tried to prevent him from serving as a minister. And think about it, because symbolically this is it. The court thinks that it can overrule the public's democratic choice, not on the basis of law, but on the basis of reasonableness. That is, by the way, not the only clause that they cited, not the only cause that they cited. They had other causes which are as shaky as this. But it just gives you an idea
How do you assess reasonableness? What is reasonableness?
Well, this is part of the reform because they said they will get rid of reasonableness as a cause of action. So there's in other judicial systems, in other systems of law, there is a test of extreme unreasonableness. So Tal, if you are a Jewish gal and you live in Herzliya and your mayor would decide to name the street that you live in after Adolf Hitler, well, I don't know that there may be a law against Nazi symbols, but suppose there isn't, then a judge can still say, look, calling a street after Adolf Hitler is just completely off the charts and unreasonable. But what they have been doing with this is that the unreasonable test has become the window of reasonableness. So now there is a test of legality. If you appeal to the Supreme Court, the court should ask, if, say, you appeal against a government action, should ask if the government action was legal. Now it has acquired the power to strike down actions or to avoid them, even if they are legal. If the judge says that, to his mind, they are not reasonable. So by reasonable, what is now meant is, does the judge like it? So basically, this is a lawless system in which judges feel they can intervene not just in the legality of decisions, but in the content of decisions of all other organs of government.
Gadi, one more question before we let you go and we wrap up. Zooming out of Israel, and I know we're talking about a reform and protests specifically taking place in the Jewish state, but as someone who's very familiar with your writings, with your books, I know that you see this as a greater issue that also pertains to other Western democracies where we see this tension between nationalism and globalism. If you can expand.
Yeah, sure. And I think this should be very familiar to American viewers and listeners, because in the United States, too, there is a globalist elite which is trying to undermine the nation states in various ways by submitting it to subduing before international organizations like the World Health Organizations, the UN, by allowing limitless immigration and also by expanding judiciaries. And this is happening all over the Western world, where these elites are trying to pull power out of electoral politics and deposit it in the bureaucracy, in the administrative state, in appointed judiciaries, and in international bodies, and all these people meet in Davos, and there they adopt a universal religion of human rights, which does not need any base in the consent of the governed. So now, based on an abstract philosophy, they can impose their will on the American people, on all other peoples, by a set of rules which has not been written in any constitution. I just came back from Hungary, and the same struggle is going on there, only it's more interesting because there's the European Union, and the European Union is trying to dictate universal values through an unelected bureaucracy and force them on the nation states. And Hungary is at the forefront of the attempt to defend the democratic rights of peoples to self-determination.
Mm-hmm. Well, they can say that they're trying to save the people from the people.
Yeah, exactly. I keep saying this because in the eyes of these elites, the problem with democracy is citizens.
All right. Professor Gadi Taub, thank you so much for these important insights. We really appreciate your time.
Thanks for having me.